My name is Monica Reeves. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in rooms where decisions were made quickly and credit moved even faster. I've learned that when people look at me, they tend to see competence without consequence. Someone steady, quiet, reliable. The kind of person you assume will absorb pressure without reacting. The kind of person you underestimate because she doesn't express ambition out loud. I've been called low maintenance. I've been praised for being easy to work with. Those words sound kind, but they often translate into something else. She won't push back. She won't disrupt the room. She'll carry what we give her. I didn't always realize how that perception shaped what people felt entitled to do in my presence. This story isn't about a villain, and it's not about revenge. It's about a slow, human unraveling, mine, and eventually theirs. It's about how small, normalized moments can accumulate into something defining. And it's about what happens when silence stops being a survival instinct and becomes a deliberate choice. There's a moment at the center of the story that some of you may already recognize from your own lives. A Monday all-hands meeting, a screen, metrics. My name displayed without context, without consent. My boss projected my so-called failure metrics on the screen during that meeting. He didn't blur my name. He looked straight at me. That moment matters, but not in the way people expect. It wasn't the climax, it was a data point. What follows is not a dramatic takedown or a public reckoning. There are no raised voices here, no sudden triumph. What follows is quieter than that. It's a story about attention, who has it, who doesn't, and what happens when someone you assumed was passive turns out to be observant, patient, and principled. I want to be clear about my intention in telling this. I'm not here to humiliate anyone, including the version of myself that stayed quiet longer than she should have. I'm also not here to package pain into entertainment. If there's any justice in this story, it's emotional, not punitive. It comes from alignment, not payback. As you listen, you won't hear me claim that I handled everything perfectly. I didn't. You'll hear rationalizations, doubt, a desire to keep things smooth, and eventually you'll hear a shift. Not loud, not visible at first, but irreversible once it happens. If you've ever been the person in the room who noticed everything and said very little, if you've ever wondered whether staying calm meant staying small, if you've ever carried a moment with you long after everyone else forgot it, then the story might feel familiar. Before I take you through what happened, let me ask you one gentle question to hold with you as we begin. Have you ever realized too late that someone had already decided who you were before you ever spoke? For a long time, I thought being dependable was the same thing as being respected. I didn't arrive at that belief consciously. It formed quietly, the way habits do when they're rewarded often enough. I was the person people looped in just to be safe. The one whose calendar filled up with meetings that had no agenda but plenty of expectations. If something went wrong, I was asked to explain it. If something went right, it simply moved on without commentary. In the office, I was described with words that sounded neutral, even complimentary. Solid, consistent, detail-oriented. No one ever said visible. No one ever said essential, even though my work touched almost everything. I learned early that if I didn't speak, people assumed I agreed. And if I did speak, calmly, precisely, it was often treated as background noise, something to be acknowledged later, if at all. I wasn't invisible in the literal sense. People knew my name. They greeted me in the hallway, but I existed in a narrow band of perception. I was seen as support, not authorship, execution, not direction, someone who would take instructions and make them work even if the instructions were flawed. What's difficult to explain is that I helped create that image. Not intentionally, but incrementally. I didn't interrupt. I waited for my turn. I softened my language. When my ideas were repeated by someone else 5 minutes later, I told myself it didn't matter, as long as the outcome was good. I equated restraint with professionalism. I thought visibility would come later. There was also something else at play. I was good at my job in ways that didn't translate well to performance. I noticed patterns others missed. I remembered decisions that were made casually and forgotten quickly. I kept records, not because I was suspicious, but because I liked continuity. I liked knowing how we got from one place to another. Over time, that habit would matter more than I realized. But back then, it just meant I became the unofficial historian. Ask Monica, she'll know. That phrase came up often. It was said kindly, but it also meant responsibility without authority, knowledge without influence. In meetings, I often sat slightly to the side, not physically pushed there. I chose it. I preferred listening to speaking. I watched who leaned forward when executives talked and who leaned back. I noticed who took notes and who didn't. I noticed who was interrupted and who was never interrupted. These observations didn't make me bitter. They made me quiet. People assumed my silence meant comfort. that I was content where I was, that I didn't want more. And because I didn't contradict that assumption, it hardened into fact. My boss in particular seemed to rely on this version of me. He spoke about me as if I were a system, not a person. Monica will handle it. Monica can clean this up. He trusted me, but in the way you trust infrastructure, you only notice it when it fails. And because I didn't fail, I stayed unnoticed. I told myself this was fine. I had stability. I had autonomy. I wasn't fighting for space the way others were. There was a quiet pride in being the person who didn't need validation, or so I thought. What I didn't see yet was that perception, once formed, becomes permission. Permission to assign, permission to overlook, permission to speak about someone instead of with them. To them, I was reliable, predictable, safe, someone who wouldn't escalate, someone who wouldn't make things uncomfortable. They didn't see someone who was paying attention. They didn't see someone who remembered everything. They didn't see someone whose sense of fairness was sharper than her need to be liked. They saw a role, and I stayed in it until I didn't. The first moment that stayed with me wasn't dramatic. No one raised their voice. No one singled me out in a way that would have made others uncomfortable. That's why it took me a while to name it for what it was. It happened during a project review, one of those recurring meetings where updates were shared, obstacles acknowledged, and leadership nodded without really engaging. I had spent weeks preparing a risk analysis for a system migration. It wasn't flashy work, but it was careful. I flagged dependencies, outlined potential failure points, and proposed a phased rollout that would give us room to adjust. When my turn came, I spoke clearly and briefly. I always did. I walked through the key risks and ended with a recommendation. There was a pause. My boss glanced at the screen, then at me, and said, "Let's not overcomplicate this." That was it. He moved on to the next slide. No questions, no discussion, just a subtle dismissal, wrapped in efficiency. A few people nodded, relieved. Complexity makes people nervous. Simplicity feels like control. I remember feeling a small tightening in my chest. Not anger, exactly, but something like surprise. Not because he disagreed, but because of how quickly the work was brushed aside. As if caution itself were a flaw. As if thoroughness were a personal indulgence. No one else reacted. The meeting continued. Notes were taken. Decisions were logged. I told myself it wasn't personal. Leaders have to make calls quickly. Maybe I hadn't framed it well. Maybe the timing was off. I replayed the moment in my head, adjusting my tone, my pacing, my choice of words, searching for a version of myself that would have landed better. That's how I absorbed it. Quietly, internally. I didn't mention it to anyone afterward. There was nothing to report. Nothing concrete. Just a sentence that lingered longer than it should have. A week later, the same risks I'd outlined began to surface. Not catastrophically. Just enough to slow things down. Meetings were added. Deadlines shifted. People asked questions I'd already answered in my analysis. I was looped into side conversations to help clarify. I did, without comment. No one connected the dots out loud. No one said, "This is what Monica warned us about." And I didn't say it either. I didn't want to be that person. The one who keeps score. The one who needs to be right. Instead, I watched something else happen. In a follow-up meeting, my boss summarized the situation. He framed the delays as unforeseen complications. Then he said, almost casually, "We might need to be more cautious next time." It was the same point I'd made earlier, now detached from my name. That was the cut. Small, clean, easy to dismiss. But it changed something in me. Not dramatically, just enough to make me more alert. I started noticing how often ideas were filtered through the hierarchy before they were validated, how language shifted depending on who spoke, how being right wasn't enough. You had to be heard by the right person, in the right way, at the right moment. I also noticed my own response. I didn't withdraw, I didn't confront, I adjusted. I documented more carefully, I saved emails, I kept drafts, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. I wanted to be able to trace the arc of decisions, even if no one else cared to. At the time, I still believed these moments were isolated, manageable, part of working in any organization. I told myself that professionalism meant letting small things go. What I didn't realize yet was that small cuts, when repeated, don't just sting. They teach others how much they can take. After that first moment, I became more aware, not hypersensitive, just attentive. It's a subtle shift, the kind you don't announce even to yourself. You simply start noticing patterns where before you saw exceptions. The dismissals didn't escalate. They settled in. It was the way my updates were shortened in recaps, the way my name was left off the slides that summarized cross-teamwork, the way decisions I influenced were attributed to the team when others' contributions were credited individually. None of it was egregious enough to protest without seeming defensive, and that, I think, is how it survives. I told myself this was the cost of being collaborative, that visibility was overrated, that influence didn't need a spotlight. But there were moments, quiet, almost forgettable ones, that contradicted that narrative. Like when a junior colleague asked me sincerely, "Are you okay with how that landed?" After a meeting where my point was interrupted and reframed by someone else. Or when a peer forwarded me a deck and said, "I used your structure, hope that's fine," without realizing the structure was the work. I always said it was fine. I started to notice how often I explained away behavior that would have bothered me if it happened to someone else. I became fluent in justification. He didn't mean it like that. They're under pressure. It's just how things work here. And maybe it was, but something else was happening too. My silence was being interpreted as consent. When my boss began speaking about my performance in meetings I wasn't in, I heard about it later, indirectly. He said you're solid, but not really leadership material. He thinks you prefer staying in the background. These comments were offered sympathetically, as if they were facts to be accepted, not assumptions to be questioned. What struck me wasn't the content, it was the certainty. A version of me was being circulated that I hadn't authored, and because I hadn't challenged it, it gained weight. I didn't confront him, not because I was afraid, but because I didn't yet see a clear boundary being crossed. I was still operating under the belief that intention mattered more than impact, that if I continued doing excellent work, the narrative would eventually correct itself. So I stayed. I adapted. I learned to speak earlier in meetings, even when I had less to say, because being first often meant being heard. I learned to phrase concerns as questions. I learned to preempt dismissal by aligning my points with leadership language. And still, the pattern held. The work kept flowing toward me. The credit flowed around me. What I didn't realize then was that I was being trained, not by malice, but by momentum. The organization had learned that I would absorb complexity without requiring acknowledgement, that I would clean up after decisions without revisiting how they were made, that I would remain calm, even when misrepresented. This wasn't cruelty, it was convenient. And convenience is hard to argue against because it doesn't announce itself. It just repeats. I remember one evening, packing up my laptop after a long day, when a thought surfaced that surprised me with its clarity. If I disappeared tomorrow, they wouldn't know what they lost until it was gone. That wasn't bitterness, it was an observation. I wasn't angry yet. I was tired in a specific way, the kind that comes from holding two truths at once. That I was valued and that I was being diminished. That I was trusted and that I wasn't seen as someone who would ever challenge the shape of things. I began to understand that respect isn't something you earn once. It's something that's either reinforced or quietly eroded over time. And by staying quiet, by staying reasonable, by staying adaptable, I had helped normalize a version of myself that was easier for others to manage than it was for me to inhabit. That realization didn't make me act, but it made me stop excusing. Once I saw the pattern, I couldn't unsee it, not because it became louder, but because it became clearer. I began to understand that what was happening wasn't personal. It was structural. A role had been assigned to me, and everyone, including me, had been quietly upholding it. I was the stabilizer, the person you turn to when something is behind schedule, underdefined, or quietly failing. I was brought in not to question the premise, but to make it work. My presence in a project often meant it was already in trouble, and because I didn't protest that role, it became my default position. I noticed how tasks were framed when they were handed to me. "Can you just take a look? This shouldn't take too long. We just need your help smoothing things out." These phrases came with an unspoken expectation. I would deliver without asking for recalibration. I would adjust my workload. I would make space. And I did, because I had learned that saying yes kept things moving, that friction was inefficient, that being agreeable was a form of competence. But the cost of that agreement was invisibility. In planning meetings, I was consulted after decisions were already leaning in a particular direction. My input was used to validate, not to shape. When I raised concerns early, they were labeled as cautionary. When those same concerns resurfaced later, they were reframed as lessons learned. I wasn't invited into the room where direction was set. I was invited into the room where consequences were managed. My boss reinforced this without ever stating it outright. He spoke to me as if I were an extension of his process. "I need you to handle this. I need you to cover this gap." There was no malice in his tone, just an assumption. Assumptions are powerful when they go unchallenged. What struck me most was how comfortable everyone was with this arrangement. I wasn't marginalized, I was relied upon. But reliance without recognition creates a strange imbalance. You're needed, but not considered. Trusted, but not consulted. I remember a moment when a colleague said, half jokingly, "If Monica's on it, we don't have to worry." Everyone laughed. It was meant as praise. But I felt something settle in my chest. If they didn't have to worry, that meant I would. I began to see how my calm demeanor was being misread as emotional neutrality, as if I didn't feel the weight of these responsibilities, as if my lack of complaint meant lack of ambition, as if professionalism meant absence of desire. And I didn't correct that misreading, not yet. Part of me still believed that playing the role well would eventually expand it, that reliability would lead to influence, that someone would notice the pattern and say, she should be in the room earlier. But roles, once established, rarely expand on their own. They calcify. The role I was assigned didn't include visibility. It didn't include authorship. It didn't include protection. It included endurance. And the more I fulfilled it, the more indispensable and replaceable I became. That contradiction sat with me longer than I expected. How can you be both? The answer, I would later realize, is that indispensability without voice is a temporary illusion. It feels like power, but it's actually exposure. At the time, though, I wasn't ready to disrupt anything. I was still trying to be reasonable, still trying to be fair, still trying to believe that if I kept showing up with integrity, the system would meet me there. It hadn't yet occurred to me that the system was working exactly as designed, and that if anything were going to change, it wouldn't be because someone else suddenly saw me differently. It would be because I did. The day something shifted didn't announce itself. There was no argument, no confrontation, no sudden clarity delivered in a single sentence. It arrived the way most real changes do, quietly, almost inconveniently, in the middle of something ordinary. It was a Monday morning, an all-hands meeting, the kind designed to signal alignment and transparency, even when neither is fully present. People filtered into the room with coffee cups and half-open laptops. Conversations tapered off as the lights dimmed and the presentation came up on the screen. I sat where I usually did, slightly off-center, close enough to see faces, far enough not to be seen first. My boss stood at the front, remote in hand, moving through slides with practiced ease. Metrics, trends, targets. The language of accountability is delivered without much nuance. I listened, not because I expected to hear anything new, but because listening had become instinct. Then a slide came up that made the room go very still. It was titled Performance Gaps. At first, it looked generic, a table, numbers, percentages. But as my eyes moved down the screen, something tightened in my chest. I recognized the structure, the categories, the phrasing, and then I saw my name. Not anonymized, not aggregated, just there, in clear text, next to a column labeled Missed Targets. For a moment, I assumed there must be some mistake. This was a draft slide, that he would move past it quickly. But he didn't. He paused. He spoke about the numbers as if they were self-explanatory, as if context were optional. He framed them as examples of where we need to improve. And then, without breaking stride, he looked directly at me. Not with anger, not with apology, with expectation. The room stayed quiet. No one said my name out loud. No one asked a question. Eyes flicked toward me, then away. The moment stretched just long enough to register, then dissolved into the next slide. I didn't react, not visibly. I didn't feel embarrassed in the way people imagine embarrassment feels. I felt something colder than that, something clarifying, because in that moment I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to articulate before. This wasn't carelessness. It was positioning. Those metrics were incomplete. They represented outcomes without constraints. They ignored dependencies, shifting priorities, and decisions made above my level. And he knew that. He had been in the meetings. He had approved the trade-offs. Still, my name was there. And more importantly, he didn't check in with me beforehand. No heads up, no conversation, no opportunity to add context. That absence spoke louder than the slide itself. I sat with my hands folded, breathing evenly, feeling the weight of the room settle into a new shape. I wasn't angry. I wasn't panicked. I was awake. As the meeting continued, I stopped taking notes. Not because I was disengaged, but because something internal had gone quiet. The part of me that absorbed, that rationalized, that softened edges. In its place was a single thought. This is data, not an insult, not a betrayal, data. This was how I was being used to signal accountability upward. This was how risk was being deflected. This was how my silence had been interpreted. Not as professionalism, but as permission. When the meeting ended, people filed out as they always did. A few offered tight smiles. One colleague touched my arm and said, "That was rough." I thanked her. Another said nothing at all. My boss didn't approach me. I returned to my desk and opened my notebook, the slim graphite one I'd carried for years. I didn't write about my feelings. I wrote down facts, dates, versions of events, decisions I'd raised, trade-offs that had been agreed upon. For the first time, I wasn't documenting to be helpful. I was documenting to be precise. That day didn't change my behavior outwardly. I still responded to messages. I still delivered work. I still spoke calmly. But internally, something had crossed a threshold. I no longer believed that being reasonable would protect me. And once that belief was gone, everything else became possible. After that Monday, my silence changed texture. Before it had been reflexive, an instinct shaped by habit and reward. Now it was deliberate, measured, chosen. Outwardly, nothing looked different. I didn't call a meeting. I didn't send a clarifying email. I didn't ask for a one-on-one to align. I let the moment stand exactly as it had been presented. Not because I agreed with it, but because I wanted to see what would happen next. This was new for me. I began to notice how quickly people filled the space when I stopped cushioning it. Questions that would have come to me were redirected elsewhere. Decisions that I might have quietly corrected were left slightly imperfect. Not broken, just less polished. No one commented on this shift. They simply adjusted. My boss, especially, seemed to interpret my calm as acceptance. He spoke to me with the same casual authority as before, assigning tasks, asking for updates, and assuming continuity. If he noticed anything had changed, he didn't acknowledge it, and that confirmed what I suspected. My value in his eyes had never been tied to my voice, so I conserved it. I answered what was asked, I delivered what was scoped, but I stopped volunteering context. I stopped anticipating needs that hadn't been articulated. I stopped smoothing over ambiguities that weren't mine to resolve. This wasn't passive aggression, it was a boundary. What surprised me most was how quickly my restraint was misread. My silence was interpreted as compliance. My lack of visible reaction was taken as emotional neutrality. People assumed I had moved on. In reality, I was paying closer attention than ever. I watched how narratives formed in meetings. Who was protected? Who was exposed? I listened for how responsibility was framed, active or passive, owned or diffused. I noticed how often leadership used the language of we when things went wrong and I when things went right. And I noticed how often my name surfaced only when something needed to be explained. I also noticed something else. The system had begun to lean in ways it hadn't before. Without my quiet corrections, small inefficiencies accumulated. Not catastrophically, but enough to be felt. People asked for clarification more often. Meetings ran longer. Decisions require revisiting. No one blamed me. They didn't connect the shift to my change in behavior. They just experienced a mild increase in friction. And that friction revealed things. It revealed how much invisible labor I'd been providing, how many decisions I'd been absorbing before they became problems, how often I'd protected others from the consequences of incomplete thinking. Still, I said nothing. Not because I wanted anyone to struggle, but because I wanted the system to show itself. During this time, I also began to refine my own position. I reviewed my role description. I compared it to what I was actually doing. I noted discrepancies, not to complain, but to understand the gap between expectation and reality. I also revisited the documentation I'd been keeping for years. Patterns emerged more clearly now. Recurring themes, repeated trade-offs, decisions that were framed as temporary but became permanent. I didn't feel vindictive. I felt composed. There's a particular clarity that comes when you stop hoping a situation will resolve itself, when you accept it as it is, without embellishment or denial. That clarity doesn't demand action, but it makes it available. People often think silence is weakness, that if you're not speaking, you're not thinking, that if you're not reacting, you're not affected. But silence can also be compression. It can be the space where understanding consolidates, where emotion settles into principle, where reaction gives way to intention. By choosing silence, I wasn't withdrawing, I was repositioning. And while no one noticed it yet, the ground beneath the familiar routines had begun to shift. What they never noticed was not a single thing. It was a process. Slow, methodical, unremarkable from the outside. There were no late nights that looked dramatic, no sudden changes in my demeanor, no visible preparation. That's because the preparation didn't look like ambition. It looked like curiosity. I began by revisiting work I'd already done. Not to relive it, but to map it. I traced how projects moved from idea to execution and where they consistently broke down. I noted who initiated decisions and who absorbed their consequences. I paid attention to which risks were acknowledged publicly and which were quietly redirected. I didn't do this to assign blame. I did it to understand the structure. I also began to ask more precise questions, not more frequent, just sharper. Questions that clarified ownership, questions that anchored decisions to timelines, questions that required answers to be documented, not just agreed to in the moment. These questions were always framed neutrally. No challenge, no accusation, just clarity. People answered without resistance. Why wouldn't they? Clarity sounds like alignment. Documentation sounds like diligence. No one suspects preparation when it's wrapped in professionalism. At the same time, I started organizing my records differently, not just chronologically, but thematically. I grouped decisions by type. I noted which ones had dependencies outside my control. I flagged moments where the scope had shifted without acknowledgement. This wasn't busy work, it was pattern recognition. I also quietly expanded my network, not upward, but outward. I spoke with peers in adjacent departments, not to vent, but to compare notes. I asked how they tracked accountability, how they handled shifting priorities, what their escalation paths looked like. These conversations were casual, informational. They revealed something important. My experience wasn't unique, but my position was. I sat at an intersection of systems that most people only touched briefly. That gave me a panoramic view that others didn't have. Still, I didn't announce any of this. I didn't hint that I was working on something. I didn't signal dissatisfaction. I continued to deliver exactly what was expected, no more, no less. What they never noticed was how my understanding of leverage was changing. I had always thought leverage was loud, hierarchical, tied to title or authority. But what I was accumulating wasn't influence, it was coherence. A clear, evidence-based narrative of how things actually worked versus how they were described. I also began to notice how often leadership relied on ambiguity. Not maliciously, but strategically. Vague ownership allows flexibility. Diffuse responsibility allows deniability. These aren't moral failings, they're organizational habits. But habits can be interrupted. The more I documented, the more I saw how exposed I had been. Not because I lacked competence, but because I had been operating without a defined perimeter. I had been absorbing risk without naming it. So I named it, to myself. I delineated where my responsibility ended and where decisions moved beyond my control. I stopped internalizing outcomes that weren't mine to own. I separated performance from optics. This internal shift had an external effect, though it remained invisible. I stopped apologizing for constraints. I stopped softening facts. I stated them plainly, without commentary. And people adjusted again. What they never noticed was that I was building something quieter than a case and stronger than a complaint. I was building optionality. Optionality is the ability to choose without urgency, to act without desperation. It comes from understanding, not just your value, but your position. I wasn't preparing to expose anyone. I wasn't planning a confrontation. I was preparing to decide, on my own terms, what alignment looked like and what misalignment required. There's a difference between endurance and strategy. Endurance keeps you in place. Strategy creates exits. And as my picture of the system sharpened, so did my awareness of something else. I was no longer dependent on being seen as agreeable. I was dependent on being accurate. Accuracy, I had learned, doesn't need an audience. It just needs time. The reveal didn't arrive with adrenaline. There was no rush, no sense of victory, no impulse to tell anyone. It came the way clarity often does, quietly, almost anticlimactically, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. I was reviewing a set of documents I'd seen dozens of times before. Project summaries, decision logs, performance reviews, notes from meetings where priorities had shifted without formal acknowledgement. I wasn't looking for anything new. I was verifying consistency. That's when I saw it. Not a single mistake. Not a dramatic contradiction. Just a pattern so clear, it felt almost impersonal. The metrics that had been attributed to me, those failure metrics from the all hands, were technically accurate. That was the part that made them effective, but they were incomplete in a way that mattered. They captured outcomes without tracing causality. They treated constraints as personal deficiencies. They collapsed shared decisions into individual accountability. And that collapse wasn't accidental. As I aligned timelines, approvals, and scope changes, a coherent narrative emerged, one that showed how responsibility had been systematically redistributed downward when results were unfavorable. Not to punish, but to protect. Risk had been redirected away from decision-makers and absorbed by those who executed. By me. The realization wasn't that I'd been wronged, it was that I'd been positioned. And positioning, unlike insult, is intentional. What struck me most was how subtle it was. There were no false statements, no fabricated data, just selective framing, enough truth to be defensible, enough omission to be misleading. That's when I understood the leverage I had. Not over a person, but over a story. Because I had the full arc. Not just the metrics, but the context. Not just the outcomes, but the decisions that shaped them. And I had it documented, not emotionally, not rhetorically, but factually. Still, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm, almost relieved. For the first time, I wasn't confused about my role in what had happened. I wasn't questioning my judgment or replaying conversations beneath. And for the hidden meaning, the picture was complete. This was the private reveal. Not that someone else had failed me, but that I had outgrown the framework I was operating in. I sat with that realization longer than I expected, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to be precise about what it meant. Precision mattered now. I asked myself difficult questions. Did I want to correct the narrative publicly? Did I want to confront my boss privately? Did I want to stay and renegotiate my role? Did I want to leave? Each option had consequences. None of them felt urgent. That was new. What I knew with certainty was this: I would never again allow my work to be used as insulation for decisions I didn't control. Not quietly, not politely, not in the name of being easy to work with. But I also knew I didn't want to burn anything down. I didn't want drama. I didn't want vindication. I wanted alignment. And alignment, I had learned, doesn't always come from explanation. Sometimes it comes from the exit. The leverage wasn't about exposing anyone. It was about choice. I could stay and redefine my perimeter, or I could step away with my integrity intact, or I could do nothing. And now that I saw the pattern, that would be a choice too. I closed my notebook and sat back in my chair. The office around me hummed with its usual rhythm, people typing, phones ringing, meetings start and end. Nothing had changed, except everything had. I didn't act that day. I didn't draft an email or book a meeting. I didn't signal anything outwardly. The reveal was private, and I intended to keep it that way, for now. Because once you see clearly, you don't need to rush. You just need to decide. The days after that realization were strangely calm. Not heavy, not urgent, just deliberate. I moved through my work as I always had, but with a different internal posture. I wasn't waiting for things to improve. I was evaluating options. There's a misconception that decision points are dramatic, that you feel torn, emotional, and pressured. Mine wasn't like that. It felt more like standing at a crossroads with a map you'd just finished drawing yourself. For the first time, I could see where each path actually led. Staying was the most obvious option. I could request a conversation, present the documentation, and ask for a redefinition of my role. I could articulate the misalignment, explain the impact of selective accountability, and advocate for clearer boundaries. It would be rational, professional, possibly effective, but it would also require something I was no longer willing to offer: trust without evidence of change. I knew how this organization handled discomfort. It absorbed it, reframed it, and waited for it to pass. Even if the conversation went well, the underlying habits would remain. I would be asking a system to change its defaults, and defaults are resilient. The second option was to confront the narrative directly, to correct the record, to contextualize the metrics publicly or semi-publicly. I had the material to do it cleanly, without accusation, just facts. But I didn't want my integrity to become a spectacle. I didn't want to be remembered as the person who pushed back or made it uncomfortable. Not because those things are wrong, but because they weren't aligned with who I wanted to be next. The third option was to do nothing, to stay, continue performing, and quietly protect myself where I could. To treat the knowledge I had as insurance, not action. But now that I understood the structure, inaction felt like consent. And consent, once given knowingly, is hard to retract. The final option was the one I hadn't allowed myself to consider until then: leaving. Not in protest, not in haste, but intentionally. Leaving meant stepping out of a system that had already decided how much of me it would acknowledge. It meant choosing coherence over continuity. It meant accepting uncertainty in exchange for alignment. I didn't romanticize it. There was no guarantee the next place would be better, but I knew this one would not be different. What made the decision irreversible wasn't anger. It was clarity. I asked myself a single question: if nothing changed here, could I respect myself for staying? The answer came quickly: no. So I began to prepare. Not visibly, not dramatically. I reviewed my finances. I updated my resume quietly. I reached out to a few trusted contacts, not with complaints, but with curiosity. I asked about cultures, about decision-making, about how accountability was handled. These conversations weren't confessional. They were exploratory. I wasn't running from something. I was moving towards something more aligned. I didn't resign immediately. I wanted to leave cleanly. I wanted to honor my responsibilities. I wanted my exit to be unambiguous, but not inflammatory. There was also something else guiding me: timing. I knew that my departure would have consequences, not because I was irreplaceable, but because my role had been shaped around my unspoken contributions. Those contributions had never been fully acknowledged, which meant they hadn't been fully transferred. I wasn't going to announce that. I wasn't going to threaten it. I was simply going to stop being the silent buffer. The decision point wasn't a moment of action. It was a moment of commitment. Once I decided to leave, everything else became execution. I didn't feel lighter, I felt steadier. And that steadiness told me I was done negotiating with a version of myself that believed endurance was the same as integrity. Once the decision was made, everything slowed down. In a good way. Not externally, but internally. There was no longer a debate running in the background of my mind. No second guessing. Just a quiet sequence of steps, each one deliberate. This was the phase no one notices. I didn't announce that I was exploring options. I didn't change my tone or my availability. I didn't perform detachment. I continued showing up exactly as expected, which made my silence blend seamlessly into the routine. Behind that routine, I'm about more honest. I began by formalizing what had always been informal. Processes I used to hold in my head, I documented cleanly. Not excessively, just enough to be accurate. I clarified handoffs. I made sure that what I owned was clearly defined and what I didn't was equally clear. This wasn't sabotage, it was alignment. I stopped absorbing ambiguity. When instructions were unclear, I asked for clarification in writing. When priorities conflicted, I asked which one took precedence. When deadlines shifted, I noted the change and the reason. None of this raised alarms. In fact, it was often welcomed. It made things feel more controlled, more professional. That's the irony of moving in silence. When you act with precision, it rarely looks threatening. At the same time, I began to disengage from work that lived outside my role, but had quietly depended on me. I didn't refuse it outright, I redirected it. That's actually better handled by, or we should loop in. I let ownership land where it belonged. Some of these redirects stuck. Others floated, unresolved. I let them. I also began to prepare my exit with the same care I applied to everything else. I made sure my responsibilities could be transferred without chaos, but not without effort. I wasn't interested in being irreplaceable. I was interested in being honest about the scope of what I did. Outside of work, I tightened my life. I simplified. I reviewed my savings. I reduced unnecessary expenses, not out of fear, but out of respect for the transition I was choosing. I had conversations with people who knew me well, not about my boss, not about the meeting, but about the version of myself I was ready to outgrow. These conversations were grounding. They reminded me that my identity wasn't bound to a role that had slowly narrowed around me. At work, no one asked if anything was wrong. That told me everything. My boss continued assigning tasks as usual. He didn't check in about the all-hands meeting. He didn't revisit the metrics. The moment had passed, for him. For me, it had crystallized. I noticed subtle shifts in how others interacted with me. Questions took longer to answer. Meetings felt slightly less efficient. There were more follow-ups, more uncertainty. Still, no one connected it to me. This was the quiet consequence of my silence, not absence, but precision. I was still contributing. I was just no longer compensating. And compensation, I had learned, is the invisible tax placed on those who don't demand clarity. I finalized my next steps quietly. An offer came through. It wasn't dramatic or perfect, but it was aligned. The role had clearer boundaries. The leadership style was different. The expectations were explicit. I didn't celebrate. I simply accepted. When I finally scheduled the meeting to give notice, it felt procedural, calm, almost anticlimactic. I wasn't bracing for impact. I wasn't rehearsing arguments. I was done explaining. Moving in silence had protected my energy, my dignity, and my future. No one had tried to stop me. No one had questioned my timing. They didn't see it coming. And that wasn't because I was deceptive. It was because they had mistaken my quiet for permanence. The consequences didn't arrive with shock. They unfolded gradually, in the spaces I used to occupy without anyone realizing they were spaces at all. My resignation was met with polite surprise. A pause, a few practice questions. My boss asked where I was going. I answered generally. He nodded, said he was happy for me, and thanked me for my contributions. There was no attempt to negotiate. That too was data. In the days that followed, I began transitioning my work. I shared documents. I walked through processes. I answered questions carefully without urgency. I didn't withhold information. I didn't editorialize. I simply showed what existed. And that's when the system began to feel the absence. Questions that had once been resolved before they surfaced now made their way into meetings. Decisions stalled longer. People reached out unsure who owned what. Tasks circled back incomplete. At first, these were treated as normal growing pains. We'll figure it out. We just need to realign. But alignment requires understanding, and understanding takes time. My name started coming up more often, not with blame, but with reference. Monica used to handle this. Do we know how Monica approached that? I wasn't there to answer. The work didn't collapse, that's important. Organizations are resilient, but the ease, the quiet efficiency, was gone. I noticed the shift most clearly in my boss. His messages became more frequent, his tone is more tentative. He asked questions he'd never asked before. He requested summaries I'd already provided. Still, he didn't acknowledge the deeper issue. He treated my departure as a logistics problem, not a structural one. That's often how consequences are misunderstood. They're seen as inconveniences rather than indicators. I stayed professional into the end. I didn't point out gaps. I didn't say, this is what I used to cover. I let the work speak for itself. In my final week, there was another all-hands meeting. I attended, not out of obligation, but out of closure. The metrics were presented again, updated, reframed, anonymized. My name wasn't there. No one mentioned the change, but I noticed who was now being asked follow-up questions. Who was being looked at when numbers dipped? Accountability had to land somewhere. After the meeting, a colleague approached me quietly. "I didn't realize how much you were doing," she said. There was no guilt in her voice, just recognition. I thanked her. That was all. The most telling moment came on my last day. As I was packing up, my boss stopped by my desk. He hesitated, then said, "I didn't realize you felt this way." I looked at him, not defensively, not angrily, and said, "I didn't realize I was expected to feel anything differently." He nodded, as if that made sense, or as if he wanted it to. The consequences weren't punishment. They were exposed. Exposure of assumptions, exposure of dependency, exposure of a role that had been built around someone who never insisted on being seen. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt complete, because the moment you stop overfunctioning, systems reveal their shape. Not maliciously, honestly. And once revealed, they can't be unseen. The urgency came late, not when I resigned, not when the transition began. It arrived only after the shape of the absence could no longer be smoothed over with optimism. At first, leadership treated the gaps as temporary, a redistribution issue, a learning curve. There was talk of documenting better and tightening processes. None of that addressed the real problem, because the problem wasn't information. It was an interpretation. I had been the connective tissue, not because I wanted to be, but because I had quietly assumed responsibility for coherence in a system that prized speed over clarity. Once I was gone, people began to notice how often decisions lacked follow-through. How frequently do priorities conflict without being reconciled? How metrics were discussed without anyone fully owning the context behind them. My boss reached out again, this time with a longer message. He asked if I would be open to a short call, just to clarify a few things. The tone was careful, respectful, almost tentative. I agreed. The call was brief. He asked about how I approached certain handoffs, how I tracked dependencies. I had suggestions for making the transition smoother. I answered honestly, factually, without editorial. What he didn't ask, and what I didn't offer, was reassurance. There was a moment of silence near the end of the call. Then he said, "I wish we'd had this conversation earlier." I believed him, but timing matters. By then, my next role was confirmed. My start date is set. My energy already reoriented. The window for renegotiation had closed, not because I was unwilling, but because the cost of staying had become clear to me. After that call, the messages slowed, then stopped. In the weeks that followed, I heard updates indirectly. Projects were being rescoped, timelines adjusted, a new role was created, one that looked suspiciously like a composite of responsibilities I'd once held, now split across two people. It wasn't a failure, it was a correction. But correction after loss always carries a different weight. What struck me most was not the scrambling, but the tone shift. Accountability language became more cautious. Metrics were contextualized more carefully. Names were blurred. Discussions became more defensive. The organization was adapting, but reactively. That's the thing about systems built on unspoken labor. They don't realize what they've relied on until it's gone. And by then, the opportunity to retain it has passed. I didn't feel satisfaction watching this unfold. I felt distance. A clean separation between what I had once internalized and what I now observed. Too late doesn't mean, it just means not with me. I had given what I could without compromising myself. I had stayed longer than comfort demanded. I had left without spectacles. By the time the organization realized what needed to change, I was already aligned elsewhere. And that was the point. Not to be missed, not to be proven right, but to be free of a role that required my silence to function. The confrontation people imagine never really happened. There was no raised voice, no dramatic revelation, no moment where everything spilled out at once. What did happen was quieter, and I think more honest. It occurred a few weeks after I'd left. My boss asked if we could meet for coffee. He framed it as casual, a chance to close the loop. I agreed, not because I felt obligated, but because I no longer felt guarded. We met in a neutral place. No conference room, no agenda. Just two people sitting across from each other, removed from hierarchy. He started by apologizing, not in a rehearsed way, not defensively, just simply. He said he hadn't realized how exposed I'd felt, that he hadn't intended to single me out, that the all-hands meeting had been about accountability, not blame. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct him. When he finished, he looked at me and asked, "Why didn't you say anything?" The question was genuine. I took a moment before answering, not to choose my words carefully, but to speak accurately. I didn't think it would change anything, I said, and I didn't want to spend energy trying to prove something that was already true. He nodded slowly. That's fair," he said. And then, after a pause, "I think I relied on you too much." I believed him. What I didn't do was reassure him. I didn't say it was okay. I didn't say I understood. I didn't minimize the impact. I simply said, "I learned a lot." That was the extent of it. We talked a bit more. about leadership, about blind spots, about how easy it is to mistake silence for resilience. There was no attempt to recruit me back, no offer to make things right retroactively. We both knew the moment had passed. The confrontation wasn't about assigning fault, it was about naming reality, calmly, without heat. When we stood to leave, he said something that stayed with me. "You always seem so composed," he said. "I assumed you were fine." I met his eyes and replied, "I was composed, I just wasn't fine." He nodded. That was enough. Walking away from that conversation, I didn't feel closure in the dramatic sense. I felt alignment. The story had been told, not loudly, not publicly, but truthfully, and that truth didn't need witnesses. I don't define myself by what I left behind. For a long time, I thought growth was about accumulation. More responsibility, more influence, more tolerance. Now I understand it differently. Growth is about subtraction, about removing what distorts you until what remains feels accurate. Who I am now is quieter than the version of me that endured, but clearer. I still listen more than I speak. That hasn't changed, but I no longer confuse listening with agreement. I ask questions earlier. I define boundaries sooner. I don't wait to be invited into conversations that affect my work. I clarify whether I belong there. And if I don't, I adjust my responsibility accordingly. I no longer carry work that requires me to be invisible to function. I no longer absorb risk that isn't acknowledged. When something is outside my control, I say so, plainly, without apology. What's different now isn't my competence, it's my relationship to it. I work in an environment where accountability is shared visibly, where metrics are contextualized, where silence is not interpreted as consent. And when it is, I correct it. Not defensively, just accurately. I've also let go of the need to be seen as easy. I aim instead to be clear. Clarity, I've learned, is a form of respect to yourself and to others. There are still moments when old instincts surface, when I feel the urge to smooth things over, to take on more than I should, to stay quiet for the sake of momentum. When that happens, I pause. I ask myself a simple question. Is this aligned or is this familiar? Familiarity is comfortable. Alignment is sustainable. I don't harbor resentment toward my old team or my former boss. They were operating within a system that rewarded certain behaviors and overlooked others. I participated in that system longer than I should have, not out of weakness, but out of belief. I believed that integrity would speak for itself. It doesn't. Integrity needs structure. It needs boundaries. It needs visibility, not performative, but precise. What I gained from that experience wasn't cynicism. It was discernment. I'm more selective now about where I invest my energy, more attentive to how responsibility is framed, more willing to walk away from situations that require me to shrink to stay. That's not dominance in the traditional sense. There's no assertion, no conquest. It's quiet dominance, the kind that comes from knowing where you stand and refusing to stand anywhere else. I don't need to prove what I can do. I need to decide where it makes sense to do it. And that decision, made once with clarity, echoes forward in ways that don't require explanation. There's a moment in stories like this where people expect a lesson to arrive fully formed, tied neatly with a moral you can repeat. Real life doesn't work that way. What it offers instead is a quieter understanding, one that settles slowly and stays. If there's a truth I carried out of that experience, it's this. Silence is never neutral. It's interpreted, translated, and often used in ways you didn't intend. Not because people are cruel, but because systems fill gaps however they can. And if you don't define yourself, something else will. For a long time, I thought staying calm meant staying above the mess. I thought professionalism meant absorbing discomfort so others wouldn't have to. I thought being reliable would eventually make me undeniable. What I learned is that reliability without boundaries doesn't create respect. It creates dependency, and dependency left unnamed turns into entitlement. This story isn't a warning against being quiet. It's a reminder that quiet people still need edges, that empathy doesn't require self-erasure, that patience, when unexamined, can become permission. My boss didn't wake up one day and decide to humiliate me. He operated within a framework that rewarded deflection and assumed my silence meant consent. The moment my name appeared on that screen wasn't an act of cruelty. It was a reflection of how I had been positioned over time. And once I saw that clearly, I couldn't unsee it. Justice, for me, didn't come from confrontation or correction. It came from alignment, from choosing not to stay in a role that required me to be smaller than my work, from walking away without burning anything down and without carrying anything with me that didn't belong. That's the part people often miss. Quiet dominance isn't about winning. It's about refusing to lose yourself slowly. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of your own experience, I want to say this gently. You don't have to explode to be taken seriously. You don't have to prove harm for it to be real. And you don't have to wait until something breaks publicly to decide you're done. Sometimes the most powerful response is not to correct the story, but to stop participating in it. I didn't leave to teach anyone a lesson. I left because I finally understood mine. And that understanding has shaped every choice since. Before we end, I want to ask you something, not rhetorically, but genuinely, because your answers matter more than mine now. Have you ever stayed quiet in a situation that slowly taught others how to treat you? And if so, what made you finally notice it? If this story resonated with you, I'd really like to read your thoughts in the comments.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.